Government is no longer working to protect our shared heritage, institutions, culture, and way of life. We're watching their deliberate destruction and dismantling, ready for replacement with something else. What might that be? Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Joining me now is Cynthia Chung, lecturer, writer, and co-founder and editor of the Rising Tide Foundation, which you can find at risingtidefoundation.net. Her new book is The Empire on Which the Black Sun Never Set, The Birth of International Fascism and Anglo-American Foreign Policy. You could check out her Substack as well, cynthiachung.substack.com. Welcome back to TNT Radio, Cynthia.
Oh, thanks for having me, Hrvoje.
I've been reading your book, and wow, it's really dense. It's really the type of book that I like to read, where it's you can't just flip through it quickly, and it touches on a lot of the topics that I have been looking at for 20 years. Right, the EU, fascism, world government, regionalism, and so forth. So maybe if you want to tell us about your new book.
Yeah, sure. Basically, it's like you said, it's a very big subject, and each chapter kind of goes through what I think is a core element to explain how fascism originated in the 20th century, and that it never went away after World War II. We're told that we were the victors against fascism, when in reality, what happened was that there were supporters of fascism on both sides, the Allies and the Axis, which I go through in detail, especially within the British establishment before World War II and during World War II and afterwards. And so there were a lot of people who were actually pretending to play on the Allied side, but were actually secretly in support of a fascist takeover. And this was quite popular, actually, all throughout Europe. And there were major players and institutions within the United States as well that were in support of this. And when the so-called victors won, in reality, what happened was the promoters of fascism on the Allied side that kept it more quiet, they secretly brought in the fascist players onto their side. And we were told that now we had entered, all of a sudden, a Cold War, which really didn't have any reason for such an extreme stance, which justified stay-behind secret armies, the Gladio operation, which was basically the secret arm of NATO that committed acts of terrorism on citizens within Europe and the United States. You can see McCarthyism, COINTELPRO are also elements out of this, MK Ultra, and they used this to justify, they justified this by saying that it needed to be done because basically people didn't know what was best for them, and that they were being too seduced by the left and the right. It's kind of a messy way of describing things, but basically that communism was at risk of taking over. And thus we had to have these types of heavy-handed interventions, of course, not by their actual name. They were always blamed on the other side, in order to move things increasingly to a far-right government that was basically always for totalitarianism, fascism. The League of Nations concept was basically, like you were saying, an idea of reviving the system of empire into approximately 6 or so regions, and that has been a policy that was continued after World War II, where the fascists, the so-called former Nazis, were brought into NATO. They were brought into many other very high-level institutions, and they continue to work towards that goal, so that where we see ourselves today with increased, lessened civil liberties and a clear move towards more totalitarian ways of dealing with things, this was something that originated, we're constantly told it's all Russia's fault. It's all China's fault. But when you look into what was being pushed as early as after the First World War, it's clear that there were very heavy level players within Europe that were pushing this and were successful. Actually, there was more of a pushback in the United States, but they eventually, sad to say, were successful in infiltrating the American institutions as well into this kind of view of a world order. And that's where we find ourselves today.
And I just wanted to read a quote from, of all people, kind of confirming what the themes in your book. And I think, some people will think, well, this is ancient history. Why another book on this? But I think we need to be doing such research because this is one of the key themes. Like this is Davos. This is Klaus Schwab. This is you're uncovering the roots of everything we're facing now. And of all people, Jazz Coleman, lead singer of The Killing Joke, that UK metal band. I saw them perform like 19 years ago, I think. Their self-titled album where Dave Grohl did the drums on. But Jazz recently gave an interview. It was fascinating. And I took out a clip and I posted it on my socials. And he says, "This is the fascism my father fought against in the last war. Rule by corporations is here with us, and I hate it. My life is over, so the thing that makes me dangerous now is I don't give a F. I'm glad that I'm moving to Switzerland, so I can be closer to Klaus." And he gives off this cackle because he also does orchestra, so I guess they hired him to do some months in Switzerland. And he said he grew up around the Tavistock Institute, and he read Technocracy by Brzezinski when he was young, and that he saw all of this coming. And just to hear him say in a defeatist sort of voice that, he said the fascism his father fought against, the Nazis. And he says, like, they're here, they've taken over, and we're screwed, basically. So, Cynthia, we're going to jump to our news break. We'll be right back.
This is James O'Neill with a check of today's headlines. House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy says if he becomes Speaker of the Chamber, he will set up a committee with a sole focus on the communist Chinese regime. President Vladimir Putin's spokesman says that Moscow will work to hold accountable the Ukrainian perpetrators of the summary execution of Russian POWs. The Philippines said that the Chinese Coast Guard forcefully retrieved a floating object in the South China Sea, which was believed to be debris from a recent Chinese rocket launch.
God, you're amazing. You're a much better listener than my wife. You're always there for me. I think I may be in love.
Where is she?
Well, it's not what it seems. I was talking to...
Who's the tramp I heard you talking to?
That was my Alexa, sweetie.
Well, she sounds like a tramp.
Fall in love with news and talk all over again with your smart device. Just tell it to play. Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, back with Cynthia Chung, her Substack, cynthiachung.substack.com. Subscribe there and check out her new book, The Empire on Which the Black Sun Never Set, The Birth of International Fascism and Anglo-American Foreign Policy. You can get the book from her direct as a PDF, or I got mine on Kindle. Sorry, I supported Jeff Bezos. It's just, it was easier for me that way. But, further themes in your book, you talk about Britain and international fascism, controlled opposition. You look at the different socialisms, guild socialism, national socialism, New Age, this push towards this neo-feudalistic corporatism. What are some, and of course, Kalergi, Count Richard von Coudenhove Kalergi. I hear a lot of people talk about, check out the Kalergi plan, so on and so forth. So, tell us more.
Sure. I also just pick up from what you were saying before about how Klaus Schwab and all of this are consequences of stuff that was already being thought up at the beginning of the 20th century. H.G. Wells, Yuval Harari has gone on record saying H.G. Wells is his a mentor, and Oswald Mosley, who is a prominent British fascist, the pre-war and during the World War II period and afterwards, he said, he has written down on record that H.G. Wells was his model for scientific fascism. And, H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell were also what influenced people like Aldous Huxley and the, father of the counterculture movement and all this. It's all connected. And so this idea of scientific fascism does have its roots with H.G. Wells, the Fabian Society with Bertrand Russell. And this is also stuff that I go through in the book, which is really important for people to know. And on a more optimistic note, the thing is that they really did think that they were going to win the Second World War, because there was actually an incredible amount of support for fascism. And to the credit of the British people, they really resisted this, even though there was quite a heavy push within their own institutions for this, including their own king and the former Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Churchill as well. And the United States also, to the credit of the people, they were not going to go along with that. But now there is, I would say, more pushback, even though it's much more scary because the technology is much more advanced. There is, I see, a lot more pushback in our time against this idea of fascism taking over. And so I think that that's a bit more of an optimistic point, and that we have competent pushback. In terms of, I guess I'll start with Kalergi. Kalergi represents, for me, it's really great because I had also heard things about him, but he wrote 2 autobiographies. So he actually put his way of thinking down on paper. He called his first autobiography Crusade for a Pan-Europe, which says a lot because his on one side of his family, the Coudenhove side, he really views the start of his family's legacy as the time of the Crusades. And it's very interesting because throughout the story you see that it was actually the fascists who kind of organized the British Mandate for Palestine. And there's a lot. I don't know if we have enough time to go through this in this interview, but at the end of the First World War, all of the empires basically went up in smoke. And the First World War was orchestrated by these players because they had to, because from what I've seen, there was actually massive organizing around national sovereign nation states economically. And so they needed a First World War to reboot and destroy these types of partnerships. But as one of the consequences to this, they also ruined their own empires, which were also going bankrupt. And so they needed a reboot of a system of empire, which was the League of Nations. And you see Kalergi very clearly is all for this idea of a League of Nations, because he has this romantic idea of when his family was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, things were just so much more, refined and cultured and beautiful. Of course, he's not thinking about it from the viewpoint of the peasants. And so this idea was to bring back that period, but even better probably in their minds. And so he wrote it down in his autobiography, details of how he was thinking about this and how he was organizing with fascists all throughout Europe, including within Britain and the United States for this plan. So it's not even conjecture. He very much makes it quite transparent. And even his work with the Vatican is pretty interesting, where when he went to see the Mussolini in I think it was 1933, he didn't see the standing pope at the time, Pope Pius the 11th, but he saw Cardinal Pacelli, who was going to become Pope Pius the 12th several years later, clearly realizing that this was going to be the future pope, because the current pope was actually criticizing fascism, and the following pope never criticized fascist Italy. And it's very, there's a chilling quote of Kalergi where he says, why should Pope Pius the 12th have criticized fascism? The Catholic branch is inherently fascist in its outlook, and there's this hierarchical way that it's formed that it's natural that Catholicism would support fascism.
Yeah, just to comment on that, I was reading that as well, and he also commented that the Protestants was more democratic. And I did an interview couple of years ago with Robert Woodbury, an academic, and he had new research. He's a social scientist, where according to his research, where Protestant Christianity had a greater presence. I think he focused on Africa, but that there was a stronger economy and more democracy. So it's just kind of interesting that Robert Woodbury's current research gels with what Kalergi was saying a century ago. And I just did want to add, regarding your optimism, just that quote from Jim Carrey in Dumb and Dumber came to mind. When he said, "So there's a chance." When she says 1 in a million, and he's like, "So you're saying there's a chance?" No, but I agree with your assessment that I agree with your assessment that it seems scarier now, the technology. But I never thought about that. I would probably agree with you. There seems to be more pushback now than there was back then. And as well, you were quoting Churchill, which I'm learning something new from. Again, a lot of new things from your book. And just over the weekend, a friend was asking me why I thought Britain left with Brexit left the EU. And I that's something I think about, because I think the plan is to create these regional unions. One theory I have is that they sort of did their work with the EU. Now they're pulling out. And then I did see they initially sought to discuss joining the USMCA, NAFTA 2.0, which is the North American Union. And in your book, you cite Churchill, where they talk about the king's dominions circle the globe, and how we belong to no single continent, but to all, not to one hemisphere, but to both, as well as to the new world as the old. And basically saying, I guess it makes sense if, like, the city of London and the British Empire, it's still there in some form behind the scenes, on the island. And I guess that would sort of help make sense of it, no? Because they're involved in all of these things all over the planet. I mean, how would you look at that?
The city of London is still the financial center of the world. And that's what's interesting, is that they have the European Union today is exactly what Kalergi was envisioning as a step towards, all out empire in these regionalizations. And Africa and, Arabia are not mentioned, because these are supposed to be slave regions. And that, they make it very clear that Europe's industry will be connected to Africa's slave labor. And, I guess you're going to just have like rich people living in Europe that don't have to do anything. And the entire continent of Africa is going to work for European wealth. But Churchill was making the point that even within these, 6 or so empires, Britain will be the top dog in all of the empires, because they have an interest in every sphere of the world. So this was the pushback to national sovereign nation states, because they could defend themselves. But once countries, as you see in European Union, you give away your power to decide what you do militarily or economically, it's not that different from a system of imperialism, where there is a command center now that tells you what you need to do into force on your own people, whether it's in the interest of your people or not. And so that's something that they've been trying to do within other areas of the world. They've been the most successful with the European Union in that, but you see the United States is also not resisting so well nowadays, that top-down type of structure. Oh, and on the note of what you're talking about for the National Socialism and the Guild Socialism and so forth. So, that's like one thing that these fascists, and you'll see James Burnham, who's an interesting person. He's the father of neoconservatism. And if you look at his background, he was Trotsky's top lieutenant for a bit. Then he, renounces Trotskyism in favor of Bertrand Russell. And, basically John Dewey as well, what the initiatives that they were working on, which was clearly what he was working on for the whole time. He was trained at Balliol College. He was trained by a Jesuit. I forgot his name now. And Bertrand Russell's all about Jesuit training as well. not in a religious sense, but just using that kind of, basically how to manipulate, condition, control someone's outlook, perspective, behavior. And James Burnham, clearly was in support of Italian fascism at a later point and so forth. But this idea of like trying to infiltrate the socialists, because they viewed, and this goes back to Georges Sorel, which is, I think, a lot for people to go through. But Georges Sorel wanted to revise Marxism to basically make it an extreme form. So the fascists viewed that they could actually reorganize socialists to make them militant fascists. And so that's why you have even the Fabian Society, right? Like they claim that they're Marxists. They claim, you have Annie Besant type characters. Bertrand Russell also, he wrote in favor of Marxism in the beginning of his career. They were trying to basically organize these groupings. That's why they infiltrated the trade unions. They were interested in the syndicalism, guild socialism, all of this, because they wanted to infiltrate these areas. It's not just the Trotskyists who used the art of permeation, right? The Fabian Society is really what made this a popular strategy in the 20th century. It existed before, of permeating. You go into an institution and you take it over from within. Their original logo was of a wolf, literally wearing, sheepskin, like a wolf in sheep's clothing. So that's why you had so many of these fascists that were calling themselves National Socialists in the beginning. And there's a lot of players like Bakunin as well, and Kropotkin, which I go over in a Huxley series I did, which are actually really tied into this too. They were all pushing for the same thing, which was a fascist world order. So it actually starts to make a lot more sense what seems to be like really messy stuff that's going on in history that seems so contradictory, and so many people are constantly changing sides. Like Bertrand Russell, for instance, is constantly like, he leaves the Fabian Society, he leaves this, he never stays in anything for too long. But if you look at what all of these players are working towards, it was ultimately always towards that same vision of a fascist world order. And a lot of these people who were calling themselves Trotskyists in the United States were all mentored by John Dewey. And then they all later became very vicious anti-communists who were in support of the most aggressive McCarthyist policies. And that's not a coincidence.
All right, we're going to jump to our break. And while we go to break, you can check out risingtidefoundation.net, CynthiaChung.substack.com, and get the book, The Empire on Which the Black Sun Never Set, The Birth of International Fascism and Anglo-American Foreign Policy. We'll be right back on TNT Radio.
Give me a minute with TNT Radio's Steve Malzberg.
Okay, so you thought that by now you've heard it all, especially when it comes to the endless claims that climate change and global warming are going to destroy us all. I mean, according to the left, we should have been dead by now, right? Either drowned under those rising sea levels or dehydrated from out-of-control temperatures. The Daily Beast now reports that the Biden administration has announced a plan to study geoengineering technologies that can be used to artificially modify the Earth's climate, with a focus on solar radiation management, which involves, get this, spraying aerosols into the atmosphere to direct sunlight away from the Earth. They want to block the sun. What could go wrong? Well, the article points out critics' concerns that when you spray these aerosols, they're going to spread out. Its effects would be felt everywhere, no matter where you initially sprayed it. Temperatures could dip so low that it results in crop loss. Changes to the atmosphere could also intensify weather events like storms, and some research suggests that solar geoengineering could even spread disease. So bundle up, everyone. These leftist climate freaks know no bounds. Thanks for giving me a minute. I'm Steve Malzberg for TNT Radio.
Challenging the consensus and debunking the narrative. This is Viewpoint.
While the mainstream media peddles fear, thousands of prominent scientists are speaking out despite a near blackout in the mainstream media. For example, Clintel was founded in 2019 by Emeritus Professor of Geophysics Gus Berghout and science journalist Marcel Kroc. This global network of 900 scientists and professionals make the point that CO2 is not a pollutant. It is essential to all life on Earth. Photosynthesis is a blessing. More CO2 is beneficial for nature, greening the earth. Additional CO2 in the air has promoted growth in global plant biomass. It is also good for agriculture, increasing the yields of crops worldwide.
The Congo provides 60% of the world's cobalt. Children as young as 7 breathe in cobalt-laden dust so you can drive an electric vehicle. We mandate that the truth be told. Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
We're back on our final stretch with Cynthia Chung, lecturer, writer, co-founder, and editor of the Rising Tide Foundation. Subscribe to her Substack, cynthiachung.substack.com. And her new book is The Empire in Which the Black Sun Never Set, The Birth of International Fascism and Anglo-American Foreign Policy. And get the book. I buy pretty much all of my guests' books, and it's probably the thing I spend the most money on. You know, it's so cheap living here in Mexico. My electricity bill's $5, water bill's $5, and I'm pretty much just buying books. And so it's a good way to help good researchers. And how would you gauge where we are today in 2022, the strength of this fascism that still lives with us in the EU? I mean, since the very beginning, I'm an EU citizen, unfortunately, and I detest as a Croatian citizen. I'm by default EU citizen, and from the beginning, I've just viewed it as a fascist, totalitarian, technocratic, globalist construct. I did have a Serbian though ask me, put me in a tight spot. The Serbs right now, Serbia is in a bad position. It's got no help really. It's like a black sheep. It's isolated, economically not doing well. And they asked me, a Serbian asked me, how do I compare my situation? Because Croatia is going to get the euro now. We're going to join the Schengen. Croatians can go to the U.S. without a visa now. And I mean, I'm an exception as a U.S. citizen. I had that already. But as a Serb, I think they would prefer to be in the EU right now because their situation is really bad. But I still want to want the EU, even though it's better than, being in the situation of Serbia, because, they've got the EU against them, NATO against them. I don't know how to respond to that, but just how would you gauge the strength of this fascism that's been here so long? Is it waning, do you think? Is it still strong? Is the EU going to collapse? In some ways, England looks like it's not doing well. Liz Truss falling apart and all that. Where do you see all of this?
Yeah, I think that, a system of empire is always fighting against its ultimate destiny, which is collapse. And it has to, take on another host in order to survive. It can only survive off of hosts. So what I see today is that they have done very well in terms of the sophistication in certain types of technology, including, the cyber warfare that's going on. And I do have concerns over, there's a clear move, I think, to try to control people's sense perceptions in what they see. Like there's probably a possibility that they could use, holographic things in the not so distant future. Jake Sullivan, who is the acolyte of Hillary Clinton, was saying in an interview very tellingly that, they think that if once they assume that they're going to be successful in their fight against Russia and China, once they're successful in this, the next thing they're going to need, because you always need to have an enemy for the people to gather around and for the United States to be the savior of the free world, are aliens. And he even said, wouldn't it be great if we had an alien invasion? And at the time when he was doing this interview, he was lamenting that there wasn't enough criticism against Russia and China. And it would be great if we just had an alien invasion and we could organize the world around this enemy, and the United States could be the savior of this. And so I do think that, it sounds pretty out there, but I do think that they're working on this type of, next level stuff. However, at the same time, I find that the leadership of most of the countries in the world, Europe is a basket case right now, and the United States is a bit of a messy situation. But I think that the leaders for the rest of the world are actually aligning themselves in a much more clear orientation and understand the game. The Turkish minister recently was even saying there was some kind of, I think, terrorist attack in Turkey recently, and he said, we know who did this, and we know that it came from Athens. Now, anyone who knows anything about Gladio knows that Athens is the central command post for NATO's Gladio to this day, that was responsible for all of the Gladio operations that were functioning in the Middle East. So I think that a lot of these leaders now are very intelligent. They are not going to be confused so easily. Europe and the United States are not so good, but, the majority of the world counts, and the Europe and the United States for the longest time thought that how they view the world is how the world will function. I think increasingly that's not how it's being played out. And the majority of the world is starting to have more of a hand to play in which direction we go. And so I think that there is a level of desperation. And I do think, they had all of these things planned out, but I think that they're doing them in an accelerated rate. They're rushing because they know they didn't foresee that there was going to be this kind of a resistance. So they're skipping steps. They're, I think, making a lot of mistakes, and things are not going according to their plan. And that's a nice thing to think about, right? Because even though there's a certain amount of success in seeing through their plan, only because people were basically sleeping for several decades and just couldn't fathom this level of villainy. But it never goes according to their plan. Like it has never been executed in the fashion that they want. So I think that people should still have faith that the human condition is not so taken over. And even though Europe and the United States is going through a low point, I think the rest of the world is actually going through a high point, and we should be optimistic.
More optimism, thank you. And you have a section in your book regarding the Middle East and the terror networks. I don't know if you cited it, but a book that comes to mind that I read years ago was by Robert Dreyfuss, Devil's Game, which talks about how the British.
Yeah, I cite that book.
Yeah, he talked about how the British Empire basically controlled, some parts of Islam in the Middle East, and we see that today with the Al Qaeda's and the ISIS and all of this. And so that was another great book as well. If you want to tell us, also, I watched it today. Finally, you made a 30-minute documentary with Matthew Ehret, The Origins of America's Secret Police. I would also recommend people check that out if you want to talk about that as well. I basically had written this article about 2 years ago because I think that people kind of put a little bit too much credit in terms of the power of the bad guys, so to speak, and that they are almost supernatural in the influence of what they can orchestrate and everything. And that's exactly what they want people to think. And they also want people to worship them or fear them. One way or another, it's good for them. If you fear or worship, that they can work with that. And so I wanted to kind of demystify this idea that they're like this all-knowing sort of almost godlike, presence, which is what they've wanted to project as an image for themselves for centuries. It's a very old game. And also just how intelligence has operated since the time of ancient Greece with the cult of Delphi. It hasn't really changed very much to this day, this very old game. And so you can be kind of afraid in some sense because it's been such a consistent presence. But at the same time, whenever people actually wake up and realize what this is, the positive
countering to that has always been superior. The tragedy has always been to not realize what it is. And so that was the point of the documentary. But it goes over how, basically the FBI was, its roots come from the Scottish Rite, Freemasonry from the very beginning. And, the kind of repercussions that the United States went through in having this takeover. Teddy Roosevelt, in my view, was like the first phase of a coup in the United States for a foreign policy, and then there was a complete takeover afterwards. But it was during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency that this creature of the FBI, institution was created under the psychopath Hoover.
Yeah, it was nice to take a break from reading, and it's everyone learns in different ways, whether reading or listening or viewing, and then looking at the FBI director and that secret police apparatus, which is still with us to this day. This morning I had an interview with John Whitehead of the Rutherford Institute. Fantastic work he does, and he bangs on about that a lot. We're down to 2 minutes to midnight. Any final thoughts? And best places to find your stuff and support your work.
Well, I think that you did a good job saying, it's mainly through my Substack, Cynthia Chung, Substack.com, and the Rising Tide Foundation focuses on the cultural aspects of things. But, knowledge really is power. I would just leave people with that. And if you understand the history, you can actually understand what the solutions are, which is at the end of the day what we really want to focus on. But people have become so confused and divided, and that's where the problem lies. So if you understand the history in a competent way, then you will be able to see the solutions in front of you more clearly.
Yes, all we need is 3 chords in the truth. Resist, fight, and win. So again, great work. Again, Cynthia, congrats on the book, The Empire in Which the Black Sun Never Set: The Birth of International Fascism and Anglo-American Foreign Policy. You can purchase it from her direct as a PDF through cynthiachung.substack.com, or if you want to pay the mafioso Jeff Bezos, give him a cut. Get it through Amazon in paperback or Kindle. Thank you again, Cynthia, and we'll be right back after the break with James Corbett.